I had no idea what was coming when I saw the notification on my phone. Package delivered. I had been waiting for this delivery all week. A special order, something rare, something that required caution. The label on the box wasn't subtle either. Fragile. Live specimen. Open with caution. A normal person would take one look at that and think twice before touching it. But not Karen. Not the self-appointed queen of the homeowners association. Not the woman who had made it her life's work to police every square inch of our neighborhood like a dictator in yoga pants. I arrived home to find my porch bare. No package. Just the faint scent of Karen's lavender-scented perfume lingering in the air, as if she had strutted past not long ago. My heart sank, but I wasn't surprised. Karen had a habit of relocating packages she deemed unfit for the neighborhood. Whether it was a neighbor's new garden gnome, a set of LED lights that were too bright, or a Halloween decoration she found unacceptable, she considered herself the gatekeeper of our deliveries. I checked my security camera footage, already knowing what I would find. Sure enough, there she was, dressed in her usual pastel cardigan, her permed hair bouncing with each step as she waltzed up my driveway. She didn't even hesitate. She picked up my box like it was an unclaimed prize, examined the label for half a second and then, completely unfazed by the glaring warning, carried it off as if it rightfully belonged to her. I stared at my screen, watching as she strutted back to her house, my package tucked under her arm like a stolen treasure. That was when it hit me. The package. The one she had just stolen. It wasn't a typical delivery. It wasn't a new gadget, a pair of shoes, or some overpriced kitchen gadget. No, this was something different. Something alive. Something that, if disturbed, would react in a way that would make Karen regret every decision she had made that day. I leaned back in my chair, a slow grin forming as realization sank in. She was about to open a box full of Hornets. Now, I'd love to tell you that I'm some kind of mastermind, that I had planned this as some elaborate revenge plot against Karen for all the misery she had caused in the neighborhood. But truth be told, this was pure dumb luck. The package contained a shipment of live Hornets for a controlled study I was conducting. They were securely housed in a specialized container, meant to be handled only by professionals. Or, anyone who actually reads the labels on their mail. I didn't call her. I didn't run over to warn her. I didn't even move. I just sat there watching the footage on repeat, waiting for the inevitable chaos to unfold. And oh, did it unfold. Not 5 minutes later, a shriek tore through the quiet suburban street. A blood-curdling, soul-piercing, "What is happening?" kind of scream. I sprinted to my window just in time to see Karen burst out of her front door, flailing wildly, her arms swinging like she was trying to fight off an invisible army. And then I saw them, tiny, furious black and yellow blurs swarming around her like a biblical plague. She stumbled down her front steps, slapping at her cardigan, her perfectly curled hair now a tangled mess of panic. She was running in circles, screaming, waving her arms like a lunatic, as if somehow that would convince the Hornets to leave her alone. The neighborhood had gathered almost instantly. People peered from their windows, some rushed onto their porches. A few even took out their phones, no doubt recording what was already the greatest moment in neighborhood history. "Karen's at it again," muttered Old Man Thompson from across the street, sipping his coffee as if this was just another Tuesday. Linda, Karen's longtime ATA rival, stood with her arms crossed, her lips twitching in an effort to suppress a grin. "Is she fighting bees?" "Nope," I said, stepping onto my porch. "Hornets." The words had barely left my mouth when Karen tripped over her own garden gnome and went tumbling into her carefully manicured flower bed. A puff of soil erupted into the air as she flailed, kicking over a decorative bird bath in the process. The ceramic piece shattered on impact, water and ceramic shards flying everywhere. "Oh, this is gold," someone whispered, phone camera zoomed in. Karen scrambled to her feet, her face flushed with panic, her sweater hanging off one shoulder. Who would do this?" she shrieked, slapping at a persistent hornet that had latched onto her sleeve. "Who delivered a box of monsters to my house?" I cleared my throat. "You mean my package?" Karen whipped around, her eyes wild, mascara running down her cheeks. "Your package," she sputtered. "Yeah," I said casually, stepping forward. "The one you stole off my porch." Silence. For the first time in ever, Karen had no words. The HOA dictator, the queen of unsolicited opinions, the woman who once called the police over a kid's lemonade stand, speechless. The crowd murmured. Some stifled laughter, others gasped, but all eyes were on her. He was caught. On camera. Red-handed. And covered in hornet welts. You. She stammered, pointing a trembling finger at me. You did this on purpose. I shrugged. I mean, I didn't tell you to steal my mail. You kinda did that all on your own. Linda burst out laughing. Full open, unfiltered laughter. Someone else snorted. A few people clapped. And for the first time, Karen looked genuinely afraid. Not of the Hornets, not of the pain, but of what was happening to her reputation. I folded my arms, enjoying the sight of the woman who had made our lives miserable finally getting a taste of her own medicine. But this was just the beginning. Karen stormed into the emergency aid meeting like a woman on a warpath, her face still blotchy from hornet stings, her once perfectly coiffed hair now resembling something a bird might mistake for a nest. She had barely taken her seat before slamming her hands onto the table, sending a stack of perfectly aligned HOA regulation papers flying in all directions. The room fell into a stunned silence as she scanned the faces of the gathered board members, her eyes blazing with a mixture of rage and desperation. This, she hissed, pointing to the multiple red welts on her arms, was an attack. A few of the board members exchanged glances, clearly trying not to smile. Linda, who had conveniently positioned herself across from Karen, leaned forward with a smirk. Oh, and who, exactly, are you accusing of attacking you with insects? Karen whipped her head toward me, nostrils flaring. Him. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, looking about as guilty as a guy who had just watched karma serve itself piping hot. Me? I asked innocently. Yes, you, she spat. You sent a box of hornets to my house. Linda raised a hand. Correction. He sent a box to his house. That you stole. A low chuckle rippled through the room. Karen's left eye twitched as she realized she had walked straight into a rhetorical bear trap. She turned her glare toward Linda, but it was clear that even she knew there was no real defense for what had happened. She stole my package, opened it despite a very clear warning, and got exactly what she deserved. Still, she wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. With a deep, exaggerated breath, she straightened her blouse and attempted to regain some of her usual composed authority. That is beside the point, she announced. The real issue here is the safety of our community. What kind of person orders live hornets to a residential neighborhood? What if a child had found that box? I tapped the table in front of me. You mean the box clearly marked with warnings in bold letters? Which you left unattended, she shot back. Linda let out an exasperated sigh. On his own porch. Karen, are you seriously trying to argue that it was his fault that you stole from him? Karen opened her mouth, shut it, then opened it again as if the words she wanted to say were betraying her. I was protecting the neighborhood, she finally declared. I couldn't help but grin. By stealing. There was a long pause before Karen let out a sharp breath through her nose, grabbing at whatever authority she had left. Regardless, she said, flipping open the HOA handbook, we have a much bigger issue. There needs to be a discussion about this kind of reckless behavior. Linda folded her arms. Oh, there's definitely going to be a discussion. But not about Jake. We should be discussing how our HOA president thinks she has the right to take other people's property whenever she feels like it. A few of the board members nodded in agreement. Karen's face paled slightly, her confidence flickering for the first time since the meeting began. I was acting in the best interest of the community, she stammered. That's funny, I mused, rubbing my chin. Because I checked my security cameras and this isn't the first package you've relocated, is it? Karen froze. The room grew eerily quiet as the weight of my words settled in. I pulled out my phone, opened my camera roll, and with a few taps, I cast the footage onto the meeting room's projector. There, in crisp high definition, was Karen walking up to my porch, scooping up my package without a second thought, and marching back to her house like she had just done the neighborhood a grand favor. Oh, look, there you go, I said cheerfully. And wow, you didn't even hesitate. Just walked right up and took it. Almost like it was a habit. A few gasps echoed around the room. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Karen's hands curled into fists as she turned an alarming shade of red. This is an invasion of privacy, she barked. Linda let out a laugh. Are you serious? You stole someone's package on camera, got attacked by hornets because of your own stupidity, and now you're trying to play the victim. She turned toward the board members. I think we all know what needs to happen here. The murmurs in the room grew louder. The HOA board, once a group Karen had bullied into submission, was now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a middle-aged woman with glasses, cleared her throat. Karen, this isn't the first time we've had complaints about overreach, she said carefully. And now we have video evidence. I think we need to take a vote on whether or not you should remain HOA president. Karen's head snapped toward the woman as though she had been physically struck. Excuse me. A man in the back spoke up. Yeah, I've had packages go missing before too. And I always just assumed it was a delivery error. But now, he looked at Karen with suspicion. The panic in Karen's eyes was undeniable now. She shook her head. You can't be serious. After everything I've done for this community? Who else is going to maintain order? Linda smirked. Oh, I think we'll manage just fine. Karen was losing control and she knew it. This is absurd, she cried. We have rules. We have procedures. And I will not be removed because of one misunderstanding. I scrolled through my phone pretending to search for something. One misunderstanding? Or several? Because I'm pretty sure I have footage of you taking Linda's Christmas wreath last year too. Linda gasped dramatically. That was you. Karen let out a noise somewhere between a whimper and a growl. That wreath was a fire hazard, she muttered weakly. The room erupted into laughter. The board members, still struggling to maintain decorum, called for a vote. It was a formality at this point. Karen had lost. She knew it. I knew it. And judging by the smug grin on Linda's face, she knew it too. Still, as the votes were tallied, Karen didn't stick around to hear the results. She stood, shoulders squared, chin lifted, as if she was about to deliver some grand farewell speech. But all she managed was a stiff, "You'll regret this," before grabbing her bag and storming out of the room. The moment the door slammed behind her, the entire HOA board let out a collective exhale. Someone chuckled. Someone else clapped. Linda turned to me, shaking her head in admiration. Well, she said, that was the most entertaining HOA meeting I've ever been to. I grinned. And we're just getting started. Karen was many things. Controlling, insufferable, an absolute menace to the neighborhood. But if there was one thing she excelled at, it was holding a grudge. After the HOA meeting disaster, after the Hornet fiasco, after the entire neighborhood bore witness to her downfall, I knew she wasn't going to take it lying down. No, Karen was plotting and she was coming for me. The signs were all there. The sudden increase in violation notices tacked onto my door. The passive-aggressive emails about community standards that were clearly directed at me. The way she glared at me every time I so much as stepped outside, as if she was willing me to combust into flames with the sheer force of her hatred. It was almost impressive, the sheer pettiness of it all. The woman had been publicly humiliated, lost her position of power, and instead of reflecting on why that might have happened, she had decided the best course of action was to make my life a living hell. I could almost admire the commitment. Almost. The real trouble started when I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox, sealed with the HOA's emblem, an emblem Karen had most definitely made herself years ago when she first took over. It was a cease and desist order, accusing me of unlawfully breeding aggressive insects, and demanding that I remove any and all illegal hives from my property. I read the letter 3 times just to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. Karen had actually legally accused me of raising an army of attack hornets. I walked straight to Linda's house, letter in hand. She took one look at it and burst out laughing. Oh, she's unhinged, Linda wheezed, wiping at her eyes. She's actually lost her mind. Yeah, I muttered, dropping onto her porch steps. But she's also dangerous. She reported me to the city. Linda's laughter immediately stopped. Wait, what? I nodded, rubbing a hand down my face. An inspector showed up at my house yesterday. Apparently, Karen reported me for harboring hazardous wildlife. Linda stared at me in disbelief, then let out a slow whistle. Wow. She's really going for it. She won't stop, I said. Not until she finds a way to win somehow. Linda folded her arms, thinking. So what's the plan? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my notes. I found a loophole in the HOA bylaws, I said, passing the screen to her. If I can get enough votes, We can call for an official dissolution of the HOA. Linda's eyebrows shot up. Wait, seriously? She scanned the text, then her grin widened. Oh, this is diabolical. You want to end the whole thing? If Karen can't be in charge, she'll still find ways to make everyone miserable, I said. But if there's no HOA? She has nothing. Linda let out an impressed chuckle. You're an evil genius and I love it. Getting the votes wasn't going to be hard. Over the years, Karen had pissed off almost everyone in the neighborhood. The problem was that HOA rules required an official meeting and a formal petition. Karen, despite her many flaws, was nothing if not a stickler for bureaucracy when it suited her. She'd block any attempt at dismantling the HOA unless we blindsided her. So we planned exactly that. Linda and I spent the next 2 days going door to door explaining the situation to our neighbors. The responses were overwhelmingly in our favor. The Johnsons still hadn't forgiven Karen for fining them over their unapproved Christmas decorations. The Parkers were still seething about her crusade against their backyard playset. And the Browns? The Browns had been waiting for this moment for years. By the end of the week, we had enough signatures to force a vote. All we needed was one final official meeting to put it to rest. But Karen wasn't done yet. The night before the vote, I stepped outside to take out my trash when I noticed something strange. A white van was parked down the street, engine idling. At first, I didn't think much of it, until I saw a man with a clipboard standing at my neighbor's door. Then another. And another. My stomach dropped. I walked closer, careful to stay out of sight. The men in the van were going door to door, talking to residents, handing out what looked like flyers. I squinted, trying to get a better look. And then I saw it. A flyer, bold red letters at the top. Save our community. Protect our HOA. Oh, she was desperate. I pulled out my phone and texted Linda. Karen's sending people door to door. She's trying to convince everyone to vote against us. Linda's reply came almost instantly. Over my dead body. I'll handle this. Less than an hour later, Linda, armed with a clipboard and an unshakable sense of determination, started her own door-to-door campaign. And this time she came with receipts. Oh, hi there, she said sweetly, approaching a group of neighbors Karen's lackeys had just left. Did Karen's little cronies come talk to you? The neighbors, an older couple who had lived in the community for over 20 years, exchanged wary glances. They said we should keep the HOA, the woman said hesitantly. They said if we get rid of it, the neighborhood will fall apart. Linda smiled, flipping through her notes. Right. Well, did they also mention that Karen personally fined 6 families last year for things that aren't even real rules? Like unsanctioned bird feeders. The couple frowned. And did they mention that she once reported someone for excessively loud laughter? The husband let out a surprised laugh. Wait, that was real. Linda nodded. Oh, it's real. And so is this. She pulled out a photo of Karen mid-Hornet attack, looking absolutely unhinged. Do we really want this woman controlling our lives? By the time Linda was done, Karen's fear-mongering had lost whatever little traction it had gained. The next day at the official vote, the results were announced. The HOA was dissolved. The room erupted into cheers. Karen, sitting at the front, looked like she had just swallowed a lemon whole. Her hands were clenched into fists, her face burning with barely contained rage. She stood up abruptly, knocking over a stack of papers. This is a disaster, she shrieked. You morons are ruining this neighborhood. Or, Linda said, smirking, we're saving it from you. Karen let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a scream. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed out. And just like that, it was over. No more Karen. No more HOA. No more stupid violations or ridiculous fines. For the first time in years, the neighborhood belonged to us again. The silence in the room after Karen stormed out was almost as satisfying as the moment the final vote was read. The HOA was gone. Officially dissolved. Years of micromanaging, ridiculous fines, and self-imposed tyranny had come to an abrupt end. For a second, no one really knew what to do. Then one by one, people started clapping, then cheering, and suddenly the entire room was buzzing with laughter and relief. It was as if a weight had been lifted off the entire neighborhood's shoulders. Linda turned to me, grinning ear to ear. I don't think I've ever seen a group of people so united in celebration. I laughed, shaking my head. Guess we all had a common enemy. People started filing out, excitedly discussing what they would do now that they weren't under Karen's iron rule. The Johnsons talked about finally repainting their shutters to the exact shade of red they had been fined for last year. The Parkers were already planning an expansion to their kids' playset. Someone else muttered about getting a trampoline just because they could. As I stepped outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the sound of newfound freedom. But there was something lingering in the air too, something unfinished. Karen might have been stripped of her title, but I knew she wasn't the type to walk away quietly. She was scheming. She had lost the war, but she would try to win some kind of battle before it was all over. It didn't take long to find out what she had planned. The next morning my phone buzzed with an unknown number calling. Normally I wouldn't answer, but something told me this was going to be worth it. I picked up, and the second I did, Karen's voice, laced with fury and desperation, blasted through the speaker. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You think you've won?" I rubbed my temple, already exhausted. "Karen, it's too early for this." "I hope you enjoyed your little victory," she sneered. "Because I am going to sue you for damages. You and everyone involved in that meeting. What you've done is illegal." I blinked, then laughed. "Dissolving an HOA through a legal vote is illegal? That's new." Karen huffed. "You don't understand how deep this goes. This neighborhood is going to fall apart without rules, without leadership. Property values will plummet. People will turn their yards into junkyards. And when that happens, I will make sure every single person knows that you are the one responsible for destroying this community." I sighed, leaning back against my counter. "Karen, we didn't destroy anything. We just took away your ability to control everyone. If you're that worried about the neighborhood, why don't you just, I don't know, be a good neighbor instead of a dictator?" Karen sputtered, clearly thrown off by the suggestion. You don't know what you're talking about. I built this community. I kept it together. And now look at it." I glanced outside. The sky was blue, birds were chirping, and kids were actually playing outside without Karen lurking around the corner ready to issue some nonsense violation. "Yeah," I said. "Looks pretty nice to me." Karen let out a frustrated growl. "You'll regret this, Jake. Mark my words." With that, she hung up, leaving me with nothing but amusement and the knowledge that she was far from finished. By noon, I had already heard the latest gossip from Linda. Karen had been seen stomping up and down the street, clipboard in hand, muttering about community disaster prevention, and taking things into her own hands. I half expected her to try to start some rogue, unofficial version of the HOA, but what she did instead was somehow even better. Around 4 in the afternoon, I stepped outside to see Karen standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac with a megaphone. "Attention neighbors," she bellowed, her voice cracking slightly as she tried to regain some sense of authority. "I am issuing an emergency neighborhood alert." I leaned against my porch railing, watching in sheer, dumbfounded fascination. A few other neighbors peeked out from their windows, some stepping onto their porches with expressions of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. Karen cleared her throat and continued, voice high with urgency. "With the dissolution of the HOA, this community is now in grave danger of falling into chaos. I am forming a volunteer task force to protect our standards and ensure that property values do not decline." Linda, who had been standing across the street, leaned toward me and whispered, Is she trying to form her own police force?" I grinned. "Looks like it." Karen's rant continued. "We cannot allow anarchy to take hold. Already I have seen violations springing up. Trash cans left 1 inch too far from the curb. A suspicious mailbox decoration. Someone is painting their house an unapproved shade of yellow." The crowd that had gathered murmured, mostly in amusement. Linda, never one to waste an opportunity, casually raised her phone and began recording. Karen's eyes flickered over to me, narrowing. "And let's not forget who started all of this," she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. This man, is the reason we are in this mess. He has single-handedly dismantled our community's order." I gave her a mock thoughtful look. "Karen, are you saying that without you, everything just falls apart?" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "Yes. Because people need structure. Without leadership, people will just do whatever they want." Linda tilted her head. "And why is that bad?" Karen looked like she had swallowed a lemon. Because rules matter." Linda smirked. Karen, I think what you're really saying is that you don't like the fact that people can finally live their lives without you controlling them. A few people in the crowd chuckled. Someone actually clapped. Karen's face went red, her lips tightening as she realized she was losing whatever small audience she had managed to gather. The real nail in the coffin came when a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, tugged on her mom's sleeve and asked loudly, "Mommy, why is that lady yelling about colors?" The laughter that followed completely shattered whatever illusion of power Karen had been clinging to. She stood there, fists clenched, chest heaving, clearly struggling to keep her composure. Then, with a dramatic huff, she stomped off down the street, muttering angrily under her breath. The moment she was out of earshot, Linda let out a breath and looked at me. "Well, that was something." I chuckled. "Think she'll ever stop?" Linda snorted. "Not a chance." And she was right. Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. But what she didn't realize was that the neighborhood was done with her. She could yell, she could scheme, she could try to claw back whatever control she thought she had. But at the end of the day, the power she had wielded for years was gone. And nothing she did was going to bring it back. Karen's defeat should have been the end of it. But if there was one thing everyone knew about her, it was that she never accepted a loss without some kind of dramatic last-ditch effort to regain control. 4 days after the vote, she roamed the neighborhood like a storm cloud looking for something, anything she could use to reassert her authority. Every morning, she stood at the edge of her driveway with a clipboard, furiously scribbling notes while pretending not to be watching everyone's every move. She glared at kids playing outside, huffed dramatically whenever someone took too long bringing in their trash bins, and paced back and forth in front of her house, muttering to herself like a villain in a low-budget soap opera. Her desperation reached its peak when she printed out homemade, neighborhood standards guidelines, and started leaving them in people's mailboxes. She even tried taping them to street signs, as if making her own set of laws could somehow undo the HOA's dissolution. It was almost sad. Almost. Linda and I had taken to watching her from my porch, placing silent bets on what her next move would be. On the 4th day post-day, she stood in front of the Johnsons' house, staring at their newly painted red shutters with an expression of absolute betrayal. She stomped up their walkway, knocked 3 times, and the second Mrs. Johnson opened the door, Karen unleashed a lecture about how red shutters were historically inappropriate for the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson blinked at her, unimpressed. Then, without a word, she shut the door in Karen's face. Linda let out a low whistle. Ouch. That had to hurt. Karen stood there for a few seconds, jaw clenched, hands balled into fists as if trying to will the door to open again. When it didn't, she huffed and marched off, her clipboard clutched so tightly in her hands that I half expected it to snap in half. It was clear to everyone that Karen didn't know what to do with herself anymore. Without the HOA, she had no real power, no authority, no rules to enforce. It was like watching a wind-up toy sputter out after years of overuse. But just when we thought she might finally accept her fate, she pulled one last stunt. One morning, a moving truck appeared in her driveway. At first, the neighborhood erupted into speculation. Was she actually leaving? Had she finally realized that without the HOA she had nothing to hold on to? People whispered excitedly, exchanging theories, trying to figure out whether we were about to witness the end of an era. But Karen wasn't moving out. She was doubling down. Instead of leaving, she was renovating. By the afternoon, her lawn was littered with supplies. Paint cans, new fencing, bizarrely expensive-looking garden statues. She had hired a team of workers, each of them looking increasingly exasperated as Karen barked orders at them. No, 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 the fence must be precisely 3 inches taller, she screeched at a man attempting to install new fencing. This is about security and aesthetic continuity. Linda and I watched in disbelief as she directed a landscaper to install an entire hedge maze in her front yard. She's lost it, Linda murmured. She's actually lost it. Karen, it seemed, had decided that if she couldn't control the whole neighborhood, she would make her own personal property the most aggressively HOA-compliant home in existence. Every rule she had ever imposed on others she was now enforcing on herself. And in classic Karen fashion, she took it to insane levels. The house was repainted to an aggressively bland shade of beige. The new fence stood a precise 3 feet taller than everyone else's. Decorative rocks were individually polished and labeled. The entire property looked less like a home and more like a monument to control freaks everywhere. As the days passed, it became increasingly obvious that this wasn't about home improvement. This was about proving a point. She wanted people to see her house, her perfectly manicured kingdom, and feel regret. She wanted them to miss the structure, the rules, the oppressive order she had once forced upon them. But if anything, it had the opposite effect. Instead of inspiring envy, it became the neighborhood joke. The once feared Karen was now a spectacle. People slowed down when they walked past her house, pointing at her ridiculously symmetrical flower arrangements. Kids dared each other to step 1 foot onto her flawlessly mowed grass just to see if she would emerge from the house, shrieking. And she did. It was around this time that the neighborhood decided to go the opposite direction. If Karen wanted to live in a personal HOA bubble, fine. The rest of us? We were going to enjoy our freedom. The Browns built a treehouse that technically didn't meet HOA height restrictions. Didn't matter. No HOA. The Parkers got not 1 but 2 trampolines. The Johnsons? They put up a giant inflatable flamingo on their lawn just to spite Karen. The day Karen saw it, she actually gasped. Linda and I watched from across the street as she stood frozen in her driveway, staring in absolute horror at the monstrous pink flamingo waving in the wind like it had been placed there by Satan himself. "This is it," Linda whispered. "This is how she breaks." And break she did. Karen marched across the street, fists clenched, nostrils flaring. She stormed up the Johnsons' driveway, rang the doorbell, and the second Mr. Johnson answered, she launched into what was probably the greatest HOA-style rant of all time. The audacity. The absolute lack of respect for the neighborhood. This is an abomination. A violation of all aesthetic standards. Mr. Johnson, unfazed, took a slow sip from his lemonade. "Karen," he said calmly, "you don't run anything anymore." Karen's face twitched. Her fingers curled into fists. And then she did the most Karen thing imaginable. She called the police. On a flamingo. By the time the cops showed up, half the neighborhood had gathered, watching in barely contained amusement as Karen hysterically explained how the inflatable bird was a public nuisance. The officer, a man who looked like he deeply regretted his career choices, listened to her ramble for a full 3 minutes before finally sighing and saying, "Ma'am, this is not a crime." Karen let out a strangled noise. But the standards. "No HO," the officer said flatly. Karen actually stomped her foot. I don't know what she expected to happen. Did she think the police were going to arrest the flamingo? Demand that the Johnsons deflate it in the name of neighborhood unity? Whatever she had envisioned, it clearly wasn't this. The officer tipped his hat and walked back to his patrol car. The crowd erupted into applause. Karen stood there, eyes darting between the flamingo, the laughing neighbors, and the departing officer. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, without a word, she turned, marched back to her house, slammed the door, and didn't come out for 2 days. And just like that, Karen from the HOA was finally, gloriously, defeated.